The Nato Alliance is studying options to offer support to troops fighting against militant jihadists in the Sahel region. UN Chief Antonio Guterres has said that the move was the most effective approach to provide sustainable and predictable support to the joint force. The force he was referring to is made up of 5,000 troops in the Sahel, drawn from Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Chad and Burkina Faso. It has been reported that the US has so far rejected the plan that has been supported by France and other African countries. The UN is calling for more international support for the soldiers in the Sahel region. Jihadist groups have been staging attacks in the Sahel countries, targeting civilians as well as soldiers. To talk to us a little bit more about this move, we're now joined by independent counter-terrorism and organised crime expert David Otto. David, always good talking to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me once more.
All right, so when we've talked, you've always said that military options probably are not going to yield the results that they desire. So supporting this force in the Sahel, is it escalating the problem or is it a first line of defense?
I think, I think first of all, as you rightly said, I've always advocated for a kind of a combination and not a prioritization of the military approach when it comes to counterinsurgency. We've seen, by way of evidence that for the past 12, well, let me say for the past decade, because of course, the French launched its Operation Barkhane in 2012. After the collapse of the Libyan government under Muammar Gaddafi. And the aim of this Operation Barkhane was to assist the Malian government and the Sahel states. You did mention, of course, the 5 member states, the Mauritania, of course, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad, which forms part of the what they call the G5 or the G5 Sahel. Now, for the past decade, we haven't seen some level of progress in terms of the military capabilities that France deployed under Operation Barkhane. Of course, the United Nations, MINUSMA, is also there, on its peace mission. And then recently we have Operation Takuba, which is made up of the European Union military force. The African Union also has, some components within the Sahel and Mali. So if we have any additional military component, I don't think that is going to be the result, because what we've seen in the past decade is that military prioritization hasn't actually worked. We need more of some kind of political will, but also developmental, progress within not just Mali, but in the Sahel. So that is what I'm advocating for. But more or less, I'm thinking this should be, something that should be led by Mali and the other states within the Sahel. And in the worst case scenario, the African Union should be leading all this.
Yeah, France traditionally has quite a lot of influence and interest in this region. And I suppose this is part of the challenge then of other people getting on board on this. Yes,
you spoil it, you break it. France has been behind the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, which then led to, some of the forces from the Azawad, region that were pledging for their independence. They then crossed over with all the arms and ammunition that they had gathered for themselves in the aftermath of the Libyan revolution. Of course, this was all down to the French and the NATO, which caused that chaos. So France has not been able to fix the situation. Rather, I think, as we spoke, recently, that France was kind of downscaling its presence on that Operation Barkhane. But on the other side, they are still contributing their military forces towards the European Union mission, the Operation Takuba, which is now ongoing. So France, will not leave this region. It says one thing, that it is downscaling its military presence, and then it then contributes, to another operation, which is ongoing. But I think the truth is, without these French colonies in the Sahel, in Central Africa, France will be in a very disadvantaged position. And from what I've seen in the past decade, France cannot do without this intervention. But also, what we have to mention is that all these nations, be it France or NATO forces, they have so much military hardware and military personnel sitting by, and they're just looking for somewhere, to train their forces and to keep them busy. And I think the Sahel provides them with that excuse, whichever way you look at it.
And I suppose after 20 years in Afghanistan, Joe Biden's not interested in getting involved in other fights?
America is now very concerned about, how it, positions itself in long, atrocious battles, that it doesn't have, the end game, at hand. America doesn't want to further damage its already damaged repetition. As you rightly mentioned, after 20 years in Afghanistan, the mission was to, remove the Taliban from power for shielding Al-Qaeda, but also to destroy Al-Qaeda. Now, what we have seen as a result is the Taliban being replaced with the Taliban, one that is now much more, armed, with weapons and, trained Taliban national, the Afghan National Army and security forces that, have been paid for by the United States. So there is no desire for the American population, for the US to directly get involved in long battles. But mind you, the US still has presence in Niger, where it operates a drone base. So it is not actually, totally out of the intervention, but it is very careful how it deploys its large forces, boots on ground in any other Afghanistan kind of, war, which would expose, the US personnel further. I remember the Tongo attack that was launched against US Special Berets forces. That was a devastating blow to the United States, in terms of its operations in the Sahel. And there have been so many inquiries and calls for the US, to, stay away from the Sahel. But, they're there, somehow, still present in the region. But a full-scale US intervention in the Sahel is something that they would have to do through some kind of, perhaps, we're contributing on with NATO forces from that perspective.
Can these militants be defeated? Because they are willing to die for these ideals that they purport to have. And it's quite difficult to battle with ideals. It's easier to fight men who are trying to live, but if people are prepared to die, that's a difficult proposition.
I think when it comes to how to defeat terrorist organizations, I often use what I call the terror triangle. And that terror triangle explains to you that a terrorist organization has three components mainly. One of that, it's its motivation and ideological component, which is the soft ideology. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with its violence. Now, the second part of that triangle, it's its ability to, fight, its ability to recruit, its ability to buy weapons and, get money to sponsor its activities. Now, that's what we call the capacity and capability angle. That's the second angle. The third angle is the ability to target soft and hard targets, which, they deem as, either enemies or they call some of them apostates. Now, what normally happens is, counterinsurgency operations of this nature that we've seen, being led by the likes of France and the US, has focused mainly on dealing with the capacity, which is the terrorist ability to recruit, the ability to launch attacks, targeting soft and hard targets. What they haven't been able to do effectively is to deal with the ideological component, to have counter and alternative narratives that are generated locally. Because at the end of the day, people are recruited into these groups based on local dynamics. What happens in the little village, that people are interested in becoming members of a jihadist organization. That has been the weakest aspect that most of these international interventions have been able to deal with. But that is the strength of the jihadist movement. Irrespective of how many people you try to eliminate in the battlefield or using drones, then if they still have the ability to recruit locally, if they still have the push and pull factors, those motivational aspects that drive people into the hands of these groups, then you haven't been able to do much. So I think that is where the mistake of most counterinsurgency operations are. They deal with one aspect of the terror triangle effectively, and sometimes, of course, they make mistakes, but most often they ignore the push and pull factors, the environmental dynamics, those very core elements that, sit down and push many people to believe that, this is a war of ideology that we must fight, irrespective of the fact that, we don't have the same capacity as the governments that we're facing.
David Otto, we'll leave it there for tonight, but as always, your thoughts and insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's counter-terrorism expert David Otto speaking to us about the call for supporting the soldiers that are on the ground in the Sahel trying to battle insurgencies in a number of countries in the region. And he's saying that there's a terror triangle that needs to be dealt with in totality rather than one element at a time.